It's all about audience first. So don't worry about your product. In fact, 99 times out of 100, like you don't need to even have a product first. You should be focusing around build an audience around a specific topic. Build a big audience, create an Instagram feed. It's all about rock climbing. Get 100,000 followers. And then once you have that 100,000 followers, you can sell them that product idea you have. And it's going to be a lot easier to sell that product idea. And here's the cool thing. If you were wrong, if that product idea didn't turn out to be so brilliant, which there's a good chance it's not as brilliant as you think it is, you still have that 100,000 followers and you can try to sell them something else related to rock climbing.
Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook podcast, where we share inspiring startup stories with practical takeaways for you, the listener. Today's guest is Aaron Dinin, who's a professor of entrepreneurship at Duke University. He's had an unconventional path into entrepreneurship, as he has a Ph.D. in English and published his own book when he was just 20 years old. From here, he went on to create venture-backed businesses before a health scare forced him to reevaluate his life. He then went full-time into teaching other entrepreneurs how to succeed in the way that he did. And he also hosts the Webmasters podcast, where he interviews people who were the founding members of the internet in terms of the people who built the companies that inspired the Amazons and everything that came afterwards. This man has interacted with many great entrepreneurs, so I really hope you enjoy today's conversation. Welcome to Entrepreneur's Handbook, Aaron. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
So I've been reading your articles for years now because you're one of the most consistent writers we have on Entrepreneur's Handbook, where every single week, like clockwork, you've got a great article for us. So what I'm curious to get started with is, what got you into this whole world of entrepreneurship in the first place? Like, why did you take this path?
To me, entrepreneurship is such a funny word, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who's ever said that. But like, I never really, I'm sure I'd heard the word, but it never occurred to me that I was an entrepreneur or entrepreneurial until I realized I started teaching entrepreneurship. And someone said, "Hey, will you teach an entrepreneurship class?" I'm like, I think so, maybe, sure. How much will you pay me? And so, it never occurred to me that I was being an entrepreneur. Instead, it was this weird hybrid of, I just had to find a way to pay the bills. And, and I wasn't like, I think I'm a terrible job applicant. And here's why. And so this is something I never understood is that when I applied to school, and so many kids are taught this, right? When you apply to school, you need to be well-rounded, which means, you need to be the president of the math team and the science team and and academic All-American and, the star football player, whatever. The more skills you have, the more things you can put on your application, the better you look. The problem is that the world doesn't need well-rounded people. The world needs well-pointed people, right? If you're going to have brain surgery tomorrow, do you want a brain surgeon who's also like a scratch golfer and an amateur improv artist? Or do you want a brain surgeon who is like zero personality and not someone you'd ever want to hang out with, but my gosh, they eat, sleep, live, breathe brain surgery, right? And so college is kind of, if you go to college, it's about, getting you well-pointed, focused, choose a major. I guess I didn't get that memo. And so I was just always interested in a bunch of different things. I'm like, ooh, I can just learn so many different things. So, we're a jack of all trades, master of none. And that pretty much defines me. And that's not very useful in the world unless you want to be an entrepreneur, an early stage entrepreneur. So I think that's how I got here.
I can relate to that a lot as well, because one of the things I remember from at university, I studied economics, and everybody wanted to either be an investment banker or a consultant, whereas I didn't really know. So I just kind of did a lot of different things. And I eventually went into consulting for many years. But then now doing what I'm doing and having all these different threads and income streams, it makes a lot more sense. I'm able to do the different things I'm interested in. And I feel like it aligns so much better with me. Do you think that's one of the core traits of an entrepreneur, is almost not having that obsession, being able to take on different projects and look at things in a different way? Because the different interests you have probably meant that you're able to see an insight that other people weren't.
I tend to tell my students that, one of the questions I always ask in one of my entrepreneurship classes, the kind of the first day is, basically, what does it mean to be entrepreneurial? What is an entrepreneur? What are some skills or qualities you would use to describe entrepreneurs? And they all say, the same thing. It's always kind of this list of, think outside the box, great leaders, which actually I don't tend to agree with, or, good at sales, good at talking, anyway, just whatever this kind of list is. They never say the core thing that I think is the most important, which is curiosity. I think entrepreneurs are great at asking questions. And they don't just accept whatever around them as truth. They kind of inherently are skeptical of it and want to know, like, well, why is this the way it is? Because that's what enables you to see your opportunities for innovation. So I think that kind of what you also referenced, like this interest in just learning a bunch of different things, is really kind of a manifestation of that curiosity. It's like, well, gosh, I can really want to know how to code a piece of software, and I can also really want to know how to take great pictures, and I can really want to know how to, fundraise, and I can really want to know how to do any number of other things. And that's just part of being an entrepreneur, is this curiosity. And we have to learn to like limit that curiosity, right? Especially as your company gets bigger, and you go from this kind of founder wearing a gajillion hats to CEO trying to operate a company. You have to really pull back on that that kind of tendency to really want to do everything. And this is why so many founders wind up leaving their companies or getting kicked out of their companies if their companies start being successful. And a lot of the entrepreneurs I've interviewed on my podcast, it's you hear the story over and over again. Like they get to a certain amount of scale, and then their bosses kick them out, and then their VCs or whatever kick them out. And they at first they're mad, and then they're like, actually, you know what? That was probably the right idea, because I sucked at being a CEO. Is much better as a founder.
And you mentioned there as well, you're interested in the early stage yourself. So did you ever have that reckoning in a way where you started building a company, it was growing, and you realized you didn't really enjoy the scale of it, and you enjoyed the early stages? When did you come to that realization that's what you enjoyed the most?
I never, I want to say I never did to my flaws, right? Like it was that I always thought I had to do everything, and that I could always do everything better than anyone else, which I still believe. The only difference between now and then is I believe I'm smarter and better than everyone else. I just also recognize that that's an entirely false belief. I just, it's that's the difference. I used to believe it was true. Now I still have it. I just realize it's false, and I guess that's to my benefit or to, again, my fatal flaws. So I'm still really bad at like delegating and outsourcing and leading, but at least I know I am.
Yeah. What were some of the early companies you started? What did they do?
I'll never forget my first the thing that I considered like my first attempt at a startup was. So many flaws in retrospect, but it's, but I didn't see any of them at the time because I was obsessed with the idea. I thought it was just such a brilliant, clever, creative idea. So I found this basically, for lack of a better word, there's a loophole in the U.S. tax code, or I guess the audience is around the world. So the U.S. tax code has a kind of an interesting little loophole. And that loophole is if you donate a ticket, right, a ticket to like a sporting event, if you donate a ticket to a charity, you get to write off the full face value of the ticket, not the market value, the face value. As how many of you've been to a soccer or a football game or a baseball game, whatever it is, there's a bunch of empty seats, right? And like the market value of those tickets are low. But of course, empty seats don't buy beers, right? They're limited value objects. So I had this brilliant idea. I was going to start a charity, right? It was going to be functioned as a charity. It was a 501c3 nonprofit that people with like extra ticket inventory could donate these tickets to. Kind of the last minute, even like the day of a game or of an event or a concert or whatever it was, donate these tickets. And then they would get to write off the full face value of the tickets, right? So they got this great tax write-off. And then I would auction those tickets off. I would auction them off for charity. And whatever they raised, the person who donated the ticket got even to choose what charity it went to. So whatever those tickets raised would go to the charity of their choice. So it was like a win-win for everyone. Like, how could this possibly be bad? And I called it a really clever name. I still think the most brilliant name I've ever come up with is called 501 Seats. Because 501 SEATS, but it was like 501c3, right? It's a brilliant name, right? So I had 501seats.org, I had 501seats.com. I was like, this was going to change the world. And oh my gosh, it was just a terrible, terrible idea. Because even though it's very clever, it has so many kind of logistical flaws to it. And so the big ones being, of course, I had a two-sided marketplace, right? Like I had to get ticket inventory from like this whole group of people over here. And then I had to get buyers of those tickets from this whole group over here. And until I had one, I wasn't going to get the other. And so you got that kind of whole chicken and the egg problem. So that was problem number one. Problem number two is it was the kind of project where I had to have new inventory every single day. So right, there was no days off. It wasn't like those tickets I got 5 weeks ago could just sit up there. Right? Like they had to sell every day. So, in order to keep people coming back, I had to have this kind of constant stream of inventory. So it just meant never ending work. And then, problem number three is, of course, in my mind, I thought this was, great, but I never actually had the empathy to consider the mind of the person who would donate these tickets. From their perspective, if you have if you run a baseball team or whatever it is, you got 20 people coming to you every day asking you for free tickets, right? Like it's just part of so like just getting through to those people is really hard. And then you actually don't have a really good incentive to donate because you actually don't want to, it decreases the value, right? You actually want that market value high. So the idea that you were giving away tickets for cheaper would actually lower the value of your product. So there's kind of an equilibrium that they're trying to hit. So they're okay with empty seats. So I didn't have the empathy to consider from their product. So those were 3 big problems. And problem number 4, which I kind of see more now, is it was a charity, which is great for the world, but I couldn't raise any venture capital. I couldn't do so, even though it kind of had to function like a venture-backed company in order to scale. Like there was no ownership, right? Like I couldn't get venture capital because it was a charity. So yeah, like anyway, it was that's the first company I remember. That's a long story, but so many mistakes all in one idea, which again I thought was so brilliant.
But it's good in a way. You had all those mistakes then, because then it meant that the things you did afterwards, you learned a lot from that one failed startup.
I haven't. It took me until I started teaching entrepreneurship to really be able to articulate my mistakes, right? Because now my job is to be able to articulate these things, and it's much harder to kind of articulate them than to kind of understand them in the moment. And so yeah, it's that was. I was in my early 20s, so it was close to 20 years ago at this point. Now I understand why it was a poor idea, but in the moment and certainly soon thereafter, I didn't understand a lot of why it was a poor idea, and that's I think to my bigger failures as well. I wasn't so self-reflective.
So we had one of the co-founders of Netflix on previously, and he said that he wrote his book about Netflix 16 years after he left the company, and it was for that very reason. He said, if I wrote the book straight away, I wouldn't have known what was successful because I was brilliant compared to I did something stupid and the company was successful anyway. And you said the self-reflection is so important, but it's also such a difficult skill because if something is doing well, you think, oh, it's because of what I did. And we see this a lot in the media, and often entrepreneurs themselves will say, this is what made my company successful, even if in reality, that was actually something which is holding them back. And how did you overcome that? How did you get that mindset of being able to work out and see for yourself like what your issues were? And you mentioned earlier about you find it hard to delegate, but at least you can admit that now.
One of the funny things, right, whenever you start teaching a subject, right, especially something like this, people are always like, oh, those who can't teach, right? I haven't heard that a gajillion times. And I never really understood that until now. Is actually there's a wildly different skill set involved in teaching versus executing. This is why Tiger Woods has a swing coach for a reason. Right? It's because he might be or might have been the greatest golfer in the world, but there's a difference between being able to do that skill and actually being able to effectively tell someone else or show someone else how to do it. And so what we see a lot with entrepreneurs, right? They can be really great at something, but they aren't necessarily always aware of why, just like any skill. And this is why you'll often hear investors, they'll invest in like a startup's first company or a third company. Company number 2 is never the one they want to invest in. A founder's first company, third company. Company number 2 is never the one they want to invest in because, if they got really lucky on the first one, luck... there's a lot of skill in luck. So I don't mean in kind of this pejorative way. They often don't realize a lot of why they were successful, and they go build number 2 and it fails miserably because they didn't realize a lot of why it was successful. And so they need to learn from that mistake. Having now, this is why I love interviewing successful founders. I don't know if you've experienced this as well. You interview these people, and it is shocking how much of their success comes from timing, right? Like. And again, I want to be like crystal clear. Timing is a skill. It is, and you can learn to develop a skill around having great timing. But how much of it comes from like being in the right place at the right time, and so it's really hard to see that in the moment, though. And that's really something you recognize with kind of self-reflection, and 16 years later or whatever it is. You
mentioned there about becoming an entrepreneur professor now. Means that you understand so much more about your own mistakes in the past. What led you to becoming going into that route? Because there's quite a big story behind that, if I remember correctly.
It's not a particularly happy story. It's more that I was running a venture-backed company that was doing pretty well, and I was teaching just a class at Duke for fun on the side, and I thought life was good, and I had a baby coming along the way, and I was really excited to be a dad and those kind of parenty things. And my daughter was born, and she went into cardiac arrest the moment she was born, pretty much. And she had to be life flighted to the big hospital nearby, and basically within a day, the doctors kind of figured out what was wrong, and she has an incredibly rare heart condition. It's called long QT syndrome, and it is a sudden arrhythmic death syndrome, which is as terrible as it sounds. It basically means her heart is capable of going to an arrhythmia at any moment that would kill her. And the triggers of these arrhythmias are kind of high stress, sudden, startling situations, such as being born, but also if like a fire alarm were suddenly to go off, that kind of jumpy feel you get that causes your heart to do, right? That can create an arrhythmia in her heart that can suddenly kill her. And by definition, you can't really know when you're going to be surprised. And so that became an important focus of my life, taking care of this little girl. And it also so happens, as the doctors explained all this to me, they kind of explained that, oh, by the way, this is a genetic disease, which means one of her parents gave it to her. And kind of based on what we know about your history, Mr. Dinin, we're pretty sure that parent is you. It's actually a miracle you're still alive. We need to get you to a doctor. So it turns out I have the same sudden arrhythmic death syndrome. It's only just kind of pure luck that it hasn't killed me yet. And so that changed life a lot. And suddenly, I found myself, even when I went back to, trying to build startups, I wasn't as into it anymore, right? Like I wanted to be home with my daughter. I wanted to be, it gives you when you're forced to confront your own mortality, it gives you a very different perspective on life. And when you could, I could be dead before the end of this podcast recording, right? If just call the police, right? Let me send you my address so you know where to send the ambulance. Anyway, that's I said it's not a happy story, but it actually kind of is. So here's kind of my spiel on it. Is there's two ways you could actually describe this whole kind of scenario. One is the way a doctor is trained to do it, which is exactly what my doctor did, which is doom and gloom, right? Is there's all for the worst, and hey, there's this disease, it's not curable, it kills lots of people, yada yada yada. The other way to do it is how an entrepreneur would do it, right? An entrepreneur, you kind of flip the context. So the doctor says, "Oh, this is terrible," but if that doctor was an entrepreneur, he would have said, "Mr. Dinin, I have some incredible news for you. There is this disease. It's called long QT syndrome. The first symptom is almost always death, but by some miracle, we've actually been able to detect it in your daughter pretty much the moment she was born, which means we can actually do things to help protect her and give her a much better chance of a long, healthy, happy life. Isn't that incredible?" Like, oh yeah, that's amazing. But wait, there's more. Here's the upsell. Because we were able to detect it in your child, we can detect it in you too, which means this thing was almost certainly going to kill you all of a sudden without warning, but now we know about it in you, and so we can actually do things to protect you and save your life. Your daughter is like your guardian angel, right? So doesn't that sound like way better? It's all in the framing. And so the other kind of offshoot of this is it changed my perspective on life, and it kind of pushed me. I needed better health insurance, and Duke University is an incredible community, incredible family, and they invited me and gave me the opportunity to teach more classes, become full-time faculty there, can keep that great health insurance. And as a result, I found that I love teaching a lot more than I actually ever loved building companies, and so it brought me to something that I get up every day super excited to be in the classroom and work with some incredible students. So that was a really long and kind of depressing, but maybe uplifting at the end answer.
It's like you said, it's very deep story there, but in a good way, because it made you learn so much more about yourself. And now you're doing something which you love, which maybe if you didn't find out about this syndrome, you might have continued to build companies and not find it very fulfilling. So in that tragedy, at least you found something now which guides you better. And through your work at the university, what kind of lessons do you think you've taught people that you've seen to then really help them in their careers as entrepreneurs?
I think one of the best lessons I've gotten to really teach, and I'm just in this unique position to teach it, is that I was actually an undergraduate at Duke. So I was an undergraduate at the school where I teach. I actually even teach a class in the very first classroom I ever had as a student, like the very first class I ever took. I took as a freshman in that classroom, which is a little surreal, right? It's like, oh, what am I doing back here? But because of that unique perspective, if you had walked into that same classroom when I was an 18-year-old student and told me, hey, 20 years from now, you're actually going to be back leading a class in this classroom. Then it was organic chemistry. I thought I was going to be a doctor. I guess I am a doctor, but not the kind of doctor my parents are proud of. I'm a doctor of English literature. That's not what they were going for. I thought I was going to be a doctor. I had like my whole life kind of projected out about how I was going to go, and basically nothing went according to those plans. And so, being back in that same exact room and being able to kind of remind students of that, whatever they think they know about themselves and about life and where things are going to go, they actually have no earthly idea. Again, if you had told that 18-year-old version of me, not only that I'd be sitting up there, but I had this crazy heart condition that could have killed me at any second while I was sitting in that classroom, right? That would have sounded just like a sci-fi, right? Not real. And so I get to stand up there in front of them and say, hey, look, not only am I telling you this, but I'm like living, breathing proof that, whatever you think about your future is just not true. So rather than trying to adhere to some sort of preconceived plan that you just think is going to happen, why don't you instead take a moment, step back, and be more reflective, and do the things that push you to learn more about yourself and about others around you. And it might not be the journey that social media has told you need to follow, but do something that makes you happy, and good things will happen.
In the last interview I did, I was asked, "Where do you see yourself in 5 years' time?" And the honest answer is, I have no idea. And I imagine the same is true for many entrepreneurs or people who are working for themselves, because part of the whole thing of what we do is we're testing different ideas out, getting the feedback on that, and then changing our path based on that. If we try to plan where we're going to be in 5 years' time now, we're probably going to get dramatically wrong, like as you said. And it's a mindset which I know many people who want stability, they think about that. Where am I going to be in 5 years' time, 10 years' time? But in entrepreneurship, that is not something which you can count on. You just don't know, because you might think you have got the best idea in the world. It could be selling seats for charity, but you just don't know what the demand is going to be like. You don't know if you're going to be able to execute the way you are. And there's so many stories of companies like Slack who they were trying to build something completely else. And the actual company was successful and then became massively successful was something they just built on the side. And you've talked about venture-backed businesses as well, because you did it yourself. I know this is something you help your students with quite a lot. And I know there's a milkshake story you shared with me before. Could you tell us a bit more about that, about how, for people listening right now who want to build their own companies and get venture backing, what kind of tips you'd give them?
Tip number one would be don't get it. That's probably tip number 1 through 25. And it's not just to be flippant. It's this is a fun thing. Gosh, I hope no one actually listens to this podcast. It's because then all my secrets will be revealed. It's that I write my articles, and I find that when I write articles about venture capital and fundraising, lots of people read them. When I write articles about sales and customer acquisition, nobody reads them. So since I'm paid by readership, I tend to write articles about venture capital and fundraising. The funny truth of it all, of course, is that the vast majority of entrepreneurs don't need to worry about fundraising, shouldn't be worried about fundraising, are distracted by fundraising. In fact, if you can get a bunch of customers, you'll never need to raise a penny in your life, right? And so many entrepreneurs we're just kind of trained in the current zeitgeist of tech entrepreneurship. It's all about how much money you raise. It's all about valuations instead of value you provide to the world, which I think is funny, right? Like you could have the greatest health tech company in the world that saves millions of lives, but the TechCrunch article would be all about how that company has raised, $100 million instead of, saved 100 million lives, right? Like there's something wildly imbalanced here. So anyway, the result of all this is that young entrepreneurs tend to get misled into believing that the goal is raising a bunch of money. And that actually should never be a goal. That should be a tool in your arsenal of ways you might achieve your goals. And if you can avoid, pulling back on, pulling that arrow out of your quiver, like avoid it. And so that's one big flaw that people, get about fundraising. They think they need to do it. The other big thing is that if you do need to fundraise, which is fine. It's a tool that's available. There's a very specific kind of company that can actually benefit greatly from fundraising. The way to fundraise is not to have a brilliant idea, go raise a bunch of money for it, and then build the idea. The way to fundraise is to build something incredible that shows the promise to becoming something much more incredible, and then go raise money for that incredible thing you've already built. And again, that was something I totally misunderstood. I used to, you read so many venture VC websites where the venture, where they write, like, I guarantee you can find this phrase on pretty much every venture capitalist website. It's, generally we focus on such and such stage of investing, but we'll even invest in an idea on the back of a napkin if it's good enough. And so that makes young entrepreneurs think like, oh, I just have to have a brilliant idea. And you know what? My idea is that brilliant idea. But what's not being said in that stupid little statement is, we'll invest in an idea on the back of the napkin if that napkin happened to be held by Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, right? Yeah, sure. But we're not going to invest in your stupid idea on the back of the napkin. Like, there's no chance, because your idea doesn't matter. What we want to see proof points and traction. So my big tip for fundraising is don't do it. And if you do it, if you still recognize that it is appropriate for your scenario, don't raise money with an idea, raise money with traction.
Do you regret fundraising yourself before you became a professor? You just said you were running a venture-backed business. Do you think you needed it in your own business? Was it a tool then, or is it you did it because you felt you needed to do it?
Oh yeah, I should have never raised venture capital for my businesses until I had customer traction. And here's the thing. This is something else that young entrepreneurs mistake, right? Just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it, right? I was able to raise money without traction because I figured out how to I understood the story. I knew the story I had to tell, and I can be a very compelling presenter. I can do the jazz hands and song and dance and laser light show that is VC fundraising. I can make a mean pitch deck. And that skill was dangerous. That's a big reason I think I had to get out of building startups, is because I was actually pretty good at raising money, even though I didn't necessarily have companies that should have been raising money. And I know people who are listening will be like, well, how in the world would that be a bad thing? Like, trust me, it is. Because what happens is when you have a bunch of money, you focus on the wrong things. All right, you're not focused on customers and customer acquisition, especially if you don't already have it, because now you're able to pay your bills. But when you aren't able to pay your bills, then the top priority becomes like, how do I get people to pay me for this? And that should always be your top priority in a business. How do I get people to pay me? Because if you don't have that, you don't have a business, right? You just have a really expensive hobby.
And what tips do you have for people to get customers early on? Everything
is about audience. This is a lot of my research and a lot of my focus as I become like an academic. The old paradigm of building businesses is all around product. And that's where you get lean startup and design thinking and all these things, right? It's like, how do you optimize products? So to make sure that you built a great product. But the secret is actually, we live in a world where, audience is, so we've always said audience is more valuable than product. And we live in a world where acquiring audience is actually, I'm going to use the word easier. I don't mean easy. I just mean it's easier to access audience than it's ever been in history. And so now there's this kind of paradigm shift where you can actually focus primarily on building audience before you even think about what product are you going to build. And so, and this is why actually a lot of the classes I teach these days are social media and social marketing classes. It's all about, which seems a little weird. It seems weird to older people, but to my students, it's it's the water they swim in. It doesn't seem weird to them. And so I teach it's kind of a colloquially known around campus as the influencer class. Right? It's students who are trying to get big followings on TikTok and things like that. I'm working on my TikTok following too. It's fun. It's a fun game. But the value is you build a big audience. Like, what can you do that? And here you are. You're in Durham, North Carolina, in my case. And I've got students putting out TikToks that are reaching millions and millions and millions of people. That's power, and by power I don't mean like, whoa, I'm going to take over the world. I'm like, it's influence. It's it's opportunity. Whether you're trying to sell a product or whether you're trying to solve global warming, or win an election or win a war, right? I mean, this is so these are things that we need to be thinking a lot more critically about. So my big so going back to your original question, which is my advice on how to get customers and think about that. It's all about audience first. So don't worry about your product. In fact, 99 times out of 100, like you don't need to even have a product first. You should be focusing around build an audience around a specific topic. If you want to build, if you're big into rock climbing, you have this great idea for like a brilliant rock climbing product. Don't build that product and start selling it. Create a YouTube channel with like rock climbing tips and tricks, right? Build a big audience. Create an Instagram feed. It's all about rock climbing. Get 100,000 followers, and then once you have that 100,000 followers, you can sell them that product idea you have, and it's going to be a lot easier to sell that product idea. And here's the cool thing: if you were wrong, if that product idea didn't turn out to be so brilliant, which there's a good chance it's not as brilliant as you think it is, you still have that 100,000 followers, and you can try to sell them something else related to rock climbing. That's how you build audience and customer acquisition.
Obviously, at the moment, you've built your audience in different ways. So you write on Entrepreneur's Handbook, you write in other publications too. And you've got your own podcast, the Webmasters Podcast. And was the Webmasters Podcast, was that created to build your audience? Or what was your motivation behind that?
No, so it's all about discovery mechanism. So actually creating a podcast is a terrible, as I say on a podcast, and so surely you know and would agree with me, terrible, I can't say terrible enough. It is a terrible way to build audience. So you don't, and I see lots of people doing it. They launch a podcast because they think like, oh, well, launch this, and all these people are going to find it. But there's really no good discovery mechanism in the podcast world. So a podcast is something you launch once you have an audience that you can kind of send them to. And I didn't even have that big an audience when I launched my podcast, so it's been a bit of an uphill battle, though it's gotten a lot bigger over time. But the podcast is not the thing growing my audience. My audience grows my podcast. So don't do a podcast to grow an audience, but you've got to find places that it's called traffic leaking. You want to find an audience that already exists, and you want to siphon off traffic from that audience to you and to your following and make them your audience. So my kind of whole constellation is Medium is a great way, because Medium sends people to you. I said that's why actually I'm so bullish on TikTok, right? Is TikTok is this one, most Instagram isn't sending you new traffic. Well, unless you do Reels, because they're desperate for people to do Reels in order to compete with TikTok. But Instagram, Twitter, like they don't send you new traffic. But TikTok is the entire setup and structure is all about sending creators new traffic. So again, it's a good place to get new eyeballs. So you want to look for these places to get new eyeballs, and then you want to bring them to what I like to call a home base. Usually it's going to be like a newsletter. So like you want to get their email address, like get me, and like those email addresses are like gold. So I bring them all into my Substack, which is Entrepreneur Office Hours, where I kind of do Q&A, that kind of stuff. That's home base. Those are kind of my kind of most vested audience. And then it's just about churning that kind of flywheel as best you can.
And I agree with you on the podcast. I think many people don't think of it from what's their advantage. When there's so many podcasts out there, why should people listen to you? And that's why, like you said, it's good to have an audience first. So the Entrepreneur's Handbook podcast is we've got a huge audience of people from Medium who we can then, one, reach large guests to get them onto the podcast, but also we can then send people who read our articles onto the podcast and create this virtuous circle where sometimes people don't want to read, they want to listen instead. So we offer that capability too. And if somebody else is to try and do what we're doing without our 50,000 email list, it would be much harder to get the traction rolling. And even if you have got a large audience, it's still difficult. You still got to think of it as a product. It's still, a podcast in itself is almost like a startup in some ways, because you need to work out the market fit. Like, why should people listen? You can't just assume you're going to build something and people are going to come. And you've got to keep variety. There's all these different factors involved. For the webmaster in particular, why did you pick that niche?
So it was so here's something you didn't mention. It was really there's two kinds of podcasts, and webmasters and your podcast here are what I like to call the stupid kind, which is it's evergreen podcast, evergreen content. And so of course, evergreen content, meaning it's content that like you can listen to it today and it'll be relevant, but you could also listen to it 3 years from now and it'll still be relevant. And while they can be fascinating in terms of how users choose to listen, what's always going to get prioritized is what we might call expiring content. So that's why podcasts about sports. Sports is naturally expiring content. If you there's a podcast about the game last night. Cool. Well, I'm going to listen to that. And if you're looking at your podcast queue, you're like, I'm going to listen to the one about the game last night, and I'm going to save Webmasters or Entrepreneurship Handbook probably for later. I'll get back to that because I can listen to that whenever. But if I don't listen to the one about the game last night, today is like not going to be relevant once there's another game. So let me listen to that now. And then, of course, what happens is people never get back to the there's a big drop off between listening to it now and getting back to it. And so Evergreen podcasts like this one and like Webmasters have this kind of the growth curve is tricky on them because there's no incentive for people to keep listening and subscribe and listen immediately. The upside of it, though, right? So that's kind of the downside. So you have these growth curves with these kind of expiring content podcasts, which is that you get a big blast at the top, but then those episodes that you create just become worthless in a very short amount of time. The upside of the Evergreen podcast, of course, is the podcast I first created 18 months ago, episode number 1, still gets new listens. It was Louis Monnier, founder of Alta Vista, and like people are still interested. And they get to that when they say, "Oh yeah, I'd like to hear that story," and so they go back, and it's still just as valuable today as it was 18 months ago when I first created it. So you'll have this kind of slow growth of every episode over time, which is kind of cool, but you don't get this subscription style readership. So, someone comes in and they listen to 10 episodes and then they never come back. Versus, if you had like a good, I got to listen to it today podcast, they just grow very differently. And I'm sure you've experienced that as well.
What have you learned from your guests? Because you've had some amazing guests on there. Has there been anybody who's really stood out to you where they changed your opinion on different concepts of entrepreneurship?
I've heard so many incredible stories at this point. So I'll just, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a kind of a poo-poo platter of the ones that jump to mind and kind of see what happens from there. So the first one that always comes to mind with me is a conversation I had with Peter Sunde, who created the Pirate Bay. Here's a guy who literally went to jail because of his startup. And there's this perception on the outside that like the dude was making all this money and he's fleecing, he's stealing content. He's a pirate. Right? He's stealing other people's content. It's piracy. But actually, talking to him, it's fascinating because two things. He's just wildly poor. He like never made any money off of any of this stuff. And that his perception, his belief is that he's actually doing the right thing. He doesn't see himself in the wrong. And I kind of tend to maybe agree with him. He certainly makes some compelling arguments. Essentially, it's the people with the power are the ones who kind of dictate right and wrong, and they've got the lawyers and the PR machines to do it. And so, someone like the music, and I've had a few guests from that kind of industry. So I had Peter Sunde, Michael Merhej, who created Audio Galaxy, which was like kind of right behind Napster, as the one and two of the big kind of early downloading sites. And then I just talked with, I want to say is Michael Robertson. I haven't released the episode yet. It's mp3.com. These are all people kind of the early pioneers in the music industry. And basically it was the record industry, the recording industry that just like sued them out of existence. And they were the ones with all the power. And so they just painted these people as though they were pirates stealing music. And now 20 years later, it turns out the things that all these people were promoting were actually the things that they've all moved to. The recording industry has all moved to. And so they just weren't, they were just trying to defend their fiefdom, basically, is what was happening. And it's not that these entrepreneurs were stealing anything or evil. And the funny thing is, Peter Sunde, so I bring up Peter, so he makes this wonderful point of, something like Google. Google goes and literally steals other people's content, right? And more as they're trying to like lock people into the ecosystem, you search for something, you never actually even have to click on someone's page because they actually pull content from that page and show it right there in the search. And Google is lauded as one of like the greatest companies that does wonderful things for the world. And they do, to be fair, but they are literally stealing other people's content and savoring it as their own. And they're getting away with it. And then you got someone like Peter Sunde, who is not stealing it, just pointing people to content, going to jail. And so that always sticks out of my mind, right? Is, what is right and wrong? I had a great conversation with another one. Is I just released an episode, so maybe it's fresh on my mind, with David McNett. He goes by Nugget. He created Flightaware, which is again not a company. Talk with like the founder of Foursquare, the founder of Flickr, or DoubleClick. These huge companies, that made billions of dollars. And then Flightaware probably isn't what you're thinking of, but fascinating story. Just about that industry and where opportunities of monetization come from, right? So they just pulled all this data of flight data, flight tracking, and then the different ways and unexpected ways that they were able to monetize it. So, for example, once they had all this data, they started to have these, CPAs of these people with private jets calling up and saying, hey, like, I need to know if this guy was using his plane for pleasure or business because I got to, deal with taxes differently. And so they were able to sell those, data reports for, $1,000 a piece, right? It was like this business model that just didn't exist. And they wouldn't have never been able to predict this business model until they put that out there. You get the person who was the CEO of the $1 billion tech company who like started from founder and all the way up to CEO. They're really good at kind of like telling the story the way that they've been trained to tell the story. And it's not always kind of as exciting or fun as interesting. So even, I'll find a big company. If I can find like the founder that left 2-3 years in, that's always the person I want to talk to, because that's usually the person who's kind of got the most, the most unedited version of the story.
But I think that's one of the things that's interesting as well about a lot of entrepreneurship advice is so much of it has interesting origins that aren't really how we use it today. It's also retconned a lot, right? Where somebody might have given it some piece of advice. For example, Steve Jobs is a classic case of everything that Steve Jobs done now is amazing. He's like every single piece of advice. But 20, 25 years ago, when he'd left Apple in not great terms, people wouldn't have looked at his advice in the same way then. And that's one of the kind of difficulties and things people need to be aware of, is making sure that it's the actual advice, not just because this person said it, it must be right. Because, like, as we said at the beginning, it could be in spite of their advice they did well.
Yeah, that sticks out. Another founder I talked to is named Jason Olem, who founded cdnow.com, which was Amazon before Amazon. Like, they were the big e-commerce pioneer, and like Jeff Bezos kind of came in a little after them. And his story was great because he said specifically that he's like, so many people will give you the kind of the filter, like retrospective kind of like I was thinking about this all along narrative, and he's like, usually that's applied afterwards, story you tell or you get trained to tell. I was talking to Shutterstock, which is John Oringer. So that's the stock photography side. And like the story around Shutterstock is that he was like a photographer going out there trying to take all these pictures, and that's how he built it. And so I was like, no, that was just like the story that the PR people came up. I was like a software engineer. I was a serial entrepreneur. And I'm like, ooh, I can put I can take the subscription service model and put it into stock photography. And shoot, I need a bunch of photographs. So I guess I'm gonna have to go take a bunch of photographs. So again, how these stories get repainted. And by the way, this is kind of one of the things I love about the little niche I'm in, which is kind of tech entrepreneurs, is so many of the early tech people, the .com boom stuff, the pets.coms of the world. I'm working on getting that guy because I think it's a fascinating story. It's like they were all vindicated. Just like 20 years, like everyone thought they were just giant like flops, and there was the delivery of all our food. That's great. There's no wonder it failed. Like no. It's just we just had to get there. So many of these people have been vindicated 20 years later in terms of what they saw. They were just a little early. So big lesson, big kind of overarching lesson, which I think I alluded to earlier, was timing is really everything in entrepreneurship. And I like to say this: timing is a force multiplier. Basically, you need two things for success and opportunity, which is significant demand and access to demand. Right, those are the key to a successful. It's not about having a brilliant idea; it's about finding a space where there's significant demand to have a problem solved, and you are able to access that demand. And the reason I kind of say access to demand is so important is because I always like to use the example of like North Korea. I know in North Korea there is significant demand for like Western goods, but I can't access it. So it doesn't matter that it exists, right? So those two things, and then timing is this force multiplier on those things. If you have really good significant demand and really great access to demand, then your timing can be kind of crummy, and it's okay. But if you have really bad demand or really bad access to demand, but you get it at the right time, right place at right time, you're going to be good. So those are kind of the three factors you've got to be weighing in. And another way to think about that is something like Uber, right? Like if you went back, let's teleport ourselves back 50 years and ask someone like, hey, would you like to be able to just press a button in your pocket and have a car pick you up wherever you are and take you exactly where you want to go? You'd say, oh yeah, that sounds amazing. But it was impossible. We just didn't have the technology. Once the technology comes around, it makes something like that possible, right? So timing is this kind of critical factor. And so much of entrepreneurial success comes down to identifying the right timing for opportunities.
It's been great to talk to you today, Aaron. But the final question I want to ask you before I let you head off is, what books do you recommend to entrepreneurs? Because you must have read so many, and obviously I guess a lot of your students will ask you about this as well. If you had to recommend like one book that you think people who are listening today who want to start their own businesses, want to become entrepreneurs, should read, what would it be?
Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. There's a bunch of different versions. That's okay. You had to go back in time, 1800s. That's good. But I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but I cannot stand books. I cannot, like, nonfiction books, just, but I always like to say that we tend to think about these, we tend to think about the Walt Whitmans of the world and the Emersons and the Thoreaus. And if you even bother to think about those people, you surely heard their names, right? As kind of great artistes. But they weren't. They were actually the YouTubers of their day. They were entrepreneurs. They were just using the kind of the popular media of the time, which happened to be things like poetry and editorials and the penny presses and novels, right? Like that's just what they were creating their content in. And it's only 150 years later that we decide they were great literature and great art. So I think there's actually a ton of kind of interesting things we can learn from those kinds of content creators about their approach to entrepreneurship, because they're as wildly valid today as they were, however many decades ago, centuries ago, even. And so usually when I'm thinking about entrepreneurship or trying to teach people about entrepreneurship, it's about putting these things into context. We have this tendency to look back in time and create all these narratives that just don't tend to be true about what it was like when you're actually there. And while I don't know what life was like back then, I know kind of the framings we tend to put on great creators now as artists and stuff is just a lie, right? So someone like Fanny Fern, who was the most popular editorialist of the 1800s, she was a Kardashian, and she was monetizing off of basically being a Kardashian the same way that the Kardashians, which are probably like the largest media brand in the world right now, maybe second to Disney, it's the Kardashians, right? They can reach over 1 billion people across social media. And so there's so much opportunity to learn from kind of past entrepreneurial successes, because those things tend to repeat themselves. So you're not really going to go read Leaves of Grass, I suspect. But it's still better than going to read whatever entrepreneurship book that you're going to read today, because I'm yet to find one that's blown me away.
And where can people learn more about you?
So aarondinin.com, AARONDININ.com. That gets you to my podcast, to my online classes, to all my writings. I need to put my TikTok on there at tiktok.com/@AaronDinin. I got a video TikTok going viral right now. It's up to 7 million. There you go.
Very good.
I'm big with all the kids.
Well, pleasure to have you on. Look forward to talking to you soon.
Great. Thank you for having me.